Ladies and gentlemen, the May 15th, 2012 meeting of the Santa Barbara City Council's Finance Committee will now come to order. First, are there any members of the public wishing to comment on items within the jurisdiction of this committee but not on today's agenda? Seeing none, we will move on to our first item. And I want to note that unlike every other Finance Committee meeting I've ever been to, we don't have any finance people here today, and we don't need them. Simon?
Good afternoon. My name is Simon Kiefer. I'm a project planner with the Community Development Department. I'm bringing to you today a request from Habitat for Humanity for a new permanent loan of home funds for a project that originally came to Finance Committee back in December of 2010. This is for 822 and 824 East Canon Perdido. And this is located on East Canon Perdido Street, just a couple of doors west of Milpas Street. So Finance Committee approved an acquisition loan back then for $925,000. This enabled Habitat to acquire the site and start planning for a new project. As expected, Habitat is back today. They have approved plans, and they're requesting that we give them permanent financing for the construction of the project now. The new project will be housing, it will be ownership housing, 12 condominium units, and there will be for low-income households. And, oops, there is a site plan. There will be 3 buildings. We've got one building here with 2 units, one building here with 3 units, and then the central driveway, and then a long building with 7 units for a total of 12. It's mostly 2- and 3-story buildings, 2 on the sort of on the edges, and then the 3 stories are in the middle. They're townhouses, and they are mostly 2-bedroom units, although there are a couple of 3-bedroom units, these 2 in the middle. And then this unit here is a 1-bedroom, as is this one back here, which is for handicap accessibility. So it's a 1-floor unit back here. And so everything sort of steps back down to the back of the lot. Habitat has gotten approval from Planning Commission and also from ABR for the project. And they're now working on their final drawings, and they're expecting to start in the fall. So let's look at the financing here. These are the project costs. It's a total of $3.8 million, of which that includes the $925,000 we gave them for acquisition of the property. It will be financed in a typical Habitat fashion. They're going to rely heavily on donated materials, donated volunteer labor, and the sweat equity of the future home buyers. It's an impressive commitment that these people make. It's a minimum of 250 hours for each individual adult person in the household, and they have to complete those hours over the course of construction. Habitat still has costs, though, for the skilled labor and the materials that they're going to need for the project, and that's why they come to us. So they're seeking a loan of $515,000. It's federal home funds, and they'll use them for construction, the cost for the skilled labor and the materials. If we combine that loan, $515,000, with the $925,000 that we've given them before, it comes to a total subsidy of $1,440,000, which is about $120,000 per unit subsidy. This is right in the middle of the range that we've given to previous Habitat projects. The challenge then will be for Habitat to do the fundraising for the remaining $2.4 million they will need to raise for this project. And they do a remarkable job. They approach foundations, corporations, individuals, and local churches to raise these funds. They leverage an incredible amount of private money for these projects. Unlike other housing projects that we finance for where there's a lot of other public money involved, ours is the only public money. And so like for their first project, which is on Villa Lucero. We gave them $240,000, and they raised $1 million. This is on top of all the donated materials and labor that they've got, but this is the actual cash that they've been able to raise for the project. For the San Pasqual project, their second project, we gave them $660,000, and they raised $1.2 million. So here we're going to give them $1.4 million, and they're going to raise $2.4. So it's amazing how far our money goes, and it's really the only way that we could support low-income home ownership opportunities without providing a huge city subsidy. So we're very appreciative of that fact. Their success in raising these funds is that they've got a great project. We've got homeowners who are active in the actual creation of their own homes, and they're deserving, they're low income. And another key part of their fundraising is that it's their restore operations. This is a store that they operate out in Goleta, where builders will donate materials that they don't need. Habitat will take them, and if it's not something that can be put into a Habitat project right away, they'll turn around and sell it to other contractors or homeowners or anybody, to the general public. And so with the proceeds from this restore, they can then fund 90% of their administrative costs. So when they go fundraising, they can assure the donors that their money is going to go directly to needy families and not to some overhead. Let me just show you a picture of what the project will look like. This is the elevation of the project from East Carrillo Street, the front. I'm sorry? Canon Perdido. And let me just tell you a little bit about the home loan that they're asking for. It will be for $515,000, and it's ultimately a forgivable loan. It's just like the loans that we've given them for the previous two Habitat projects. We will loan the full amount to Habitat, which they'll then use for construction. There'll be 0% interest on that loan. They won't be making any payments. And upon completion of construction, that $515,000 loan will then convert into separate loans with each of the homeowners. So there'll be 12 separate loans for $43,000. And that's how our loan will get transformed. And that's just like the RDA loan that we've given them. That $925,000 loan upon completion of construction will then convert to individual loans of $77,000 each. There will be a Habitat loan in first position at about $200,000. And so you might wonder, how can low-income people afford mortgages that total $320,000? And the answer is that we couldn't make the terms more favorable. The city loans will have 0% interest. There won't be any payments made, and upon the conclusion of 90 years, then this loan will be forgiven. And that's the two city loans. The Habitat loan will be structured in such a way that the total housing expenses for a household, so that's going to be payment on the loan, it's going to be their taxes, it's going to be the homeowner association dues, it's going to be their insurance, all of that together can't exceed 35% of their income. And so that means that the term of that Habitat loan might get pushed out to 40, 50 years in order to eventually pay it all off, but it will be affordable throughout that time period. If somebody were to then leave, to sell their unit, want to leave, before 90 years pass, then Habitat would find a new low-income home buyer. We would sign new loans, city loans, new Habitat loan, and a new covenant for the remainder of that 90-year term. This would be repeated until that 90-year term ends. And I'll just show you one more elevation here. This is from the rear. So this is a timely request for us. The city needs to commit about $725,000 in home funds before June 30th. And this request here today, plus the one I'm going to be coming back to you for next week, would help meet that. And we would fully meet our commitment deadline with these two actions. If we don't do this, then HUD would take the money back. Lastly, it's home funds are hard to use. They HUD puts on a lot of regulations, and they're hard now, and they're going to get even harder in the fall. But one of the requirements is that 15% of the money that we get from HUD has to be spent on community housing development organizations, and they've got very strict guidelines as to what these organizations have to be. Unfortunately, Habitat meets those requirements, so then we're able to meet our requirement to fund local housing development organizations.
Ms. Maria?
Thank you. So there is no competition from our own housing authority for the money. It has to go to a community organization
For the
for the money.
Councilmember Murillo, yes, for this particular set-aside of community housing development organization funds, that can't go to the housing authority. They wouldn't qualify as a CHODO.
Thank you.
We also have Joyce McCullough here and John Peterson from Habitat for Humanity, if you have any questions to direct to them.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Mr. Kiefer, I have one question. Could you talk a little bit more about this home funding, the source of funds, how much we get, how it needs to be spent?
Councilmember Francisco, we have typically received about $800,000 to $900,000 of federal home funds every year. This year, however, being an exception, we expect to receive about $400,000 this year. So quite a big reduction in our home funds, and we support a number of projects with home funds. We've funded the Housing Authority. We've funded a number of nonprofits. I can send you a list of projects that we funded with home funds.
Uh-huh.
I'll be coming back next week, as I said, with a request for tenant-based rental assistance funds that will go to the Housing Authority plus a couple other nonprofits. So
Okay.
we spread the money out quite widely.
Great, thanks. I've gotten some emails from people wondering where the city's coming up with this money, and I just wanted to make it clear to people that this is federal funding that has to be spent on this purpose.
Yes, Councilmember Francisco, these are home funds. They, at the end of the day, whenever you spend a home dollar, it has to go towards an affordable unit. There has to be a one-to-one connection.
Okay, thank you. Other questions from the committee members? Mr. White.
Could you tell us about who qualifies to get these units?
Councilmember White,
How that works?
okay, they have to be low-income people, so their incomes can't exceed 80% of area median income, and 80% of median for a family of four is about. Actually, Habitat would probably better be able to describe what their outreach efforts have been, because they've just gone through it. They've had tremendous response. Hi. Yeah, just.
And could you
There we go.
please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Joyce McCullough. I'm the Executive Director of Habitat for Humanity, Southern Santa Barbara County. So thank you for taking this matter into consideration. As you asked, Councilmember White, we have just completed our orientation meetings that we do every time we have a project and homes that will be on offer. So we hold as wide a variety geographically of meetings that we can. They're orientation meetings. We have a presentation that we make about our qualifications and selection criteria. We had meetings in Carpinteria on the west side, on the east side, Outer State Street, and Goleta, Isla Vista this time. We had over 500 families come and attend these meetings. In the end, we gave out over 300 applications. So we are receiving those applications back. And among the requirements that we have, we look at three primary categories. Their need, the income criteria, of course, their ability to pay and their willingness to partner. And the willingness to partner goes directly to their agreement to provide the sweat equity. Under ability to pay, we're looking at folks that have lived or worked in the Santa Barbara area that are legal U.S. residents and can continue to make payments to Habitat. We carry that first mortgage. We don't charge interest on it. So we turn from builder to banker. We want to make sure we've got people with good credit that we can be assured will repay their first mortgage. It is not in any way a lottery. We have a very lengthy mortgage. We look for all sorts of documents from W-2 forms to past year's income returns, utility bills, car insurance, and of course the residency documents. We have a committee that goes through that. We look at all those factors. We do credit checks and background checks, and then we rank them in order by those first three criteria: their need, their willingness to partner, and their ability to pay. And then our board of directors makes a final selection. We anticipate that to happen by July. In the meantime, our committee is working through the applications, and we actually do home visits, and that helps us also to establish need. As we look at the conditions that we find people living in this community, it's heartbreaking, but it also provides them a sense of hope that they can have a safe, decent, affordable place to live. So that's kind of our process.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments?
May I express my support for the project, and are we ready for a motion?
I would be pleased to hear a motion.
I move that we recommend the council approve this loan. Congratulations.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much.
On to the next item. Good afternoon, Ms. Zachary.
Good afternoon, Chair Francisco and members of the Finance Committee. I'm Jill Zachary. I'm the Assistant Parks and Recreation Director. And today we are before the Finance Committee as a follow-up to a request from City Council related to the Andre Clark Bird Refuge Vegetation Maintenance and Restoration Project. Just for a little background for those that may not be aware of the Bird Refuge, it's a 42-acre open space park. It includes a 92-acre lake. The purpose of the project is to restore water conveyance, address the mosquito areas within the lake where we have vegetation that contributes to high summer populations of mosquitoes, and reduce the potential for flooding. When we were before Council in December, we were requesting that Council approve final funding for project construction. The project was underway a number of years ago through design, permitting, and we were ready for construction. And at that time, we requested that Council fully fund the project. The total project cost was $403,000. Initial allocations were $117,000 in the general fund CIP. Those funds were used for the design and permitting process. At the time, we requested that Council and Council approved allocation of transfer of some monies from the existing Parks and Recreation CIP account, and then also an allocation from the general fund in the amount of $49,452. At the time, Council approved that when we were able to move forward with the first phase of the project. It's a 5-year project, and remove key areas of wetland vegetation that were in concrete culverts that drain into the bird refuge and contributed to flooding on Old Coast Highway and Highway 101, and then also in other around the platform areas, which were contributing to flooding as well, and also primarily to mosquito production. So working with Vector Control District, we also identified the specific areas that would allow them to go in and manage in the summer months for mosquito abatement. So we did complete that work. The restoration portion of the project begins in the fall, and then throughout the 5-year period, we'll continue to maintain the areas where the vegetation was removed. Council's request in December was that we refer the project to the Creeks Advisory Committee, and that we ask the Creeks Advisory Committee whether it would be appropriate for Measure B funds to be used to backfill general fund contribution for the project. We were at the Creeks Advisory Committee on March 14th. Your council agenda report includes that information, and the recommendation from the Creeks Advisory Committee, and just generally, the Creeks Advisory Committee did not recommend that Measure B support the project, that it wasn't consistent with the 2003 guidelines. Those are also included as an attachment to your report. So we are back here to the Finance Committee to report that out to you, the action of the Creeks Advisory Committee, and ask that you forward a recommendation to the City Council. And that concludes my remarks. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Questions from the committee members? Mr. White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what is staff's, besides the committee, what is staff's position on this?
Councilmember White, members of the Finance Committee, the bird refuge is managed by the Parks Division, and it has been historically. Over the years, when we've had issues with emergent vegetation, we've had to apply for emergency permits to remove the vegetation, either as a result of flooding or because of the concern for West Nile virus. Because the project is largely focused on managing an existing resource for the purposes of public health and safety, and is something that is the responsibility of the Parks Division. We were asked by the permitting agencies not to apply for emergency permits, but to put together kind of a longer-term plan for maintenance, which is what we did. And a similar project would be the sediment management plan that the Waterfront Department moves forward with on a 5 or now a 10-year basis, which includes all the different departments of how we manage the beachfront area. Doesn't necessarily address restoration or water quality or the objectives of Measure B and the Creeks program. Because this project's focused largely on human health and safety, looking at flooding, the staff recommendation to council in December was that the general fund support the project. At the same time, I would add that we do have a long-term plan in the Creeks CIP to really look at the feasibility of improving water quality in the bird refuge, undertaking a large-scale restoration project, and that is something that would require an extensive amount of planning and technical studies. We'd be looking at the potential to restore tidal influence. That is beyond the scope of daily O&M, operations and maintenance, of the Parks and Recreation Department. And in the CIP, there is recommendations through the 6 years that Measure B funds be used for that type of project rather than daily maintenance.
Questions, Ms. Murillo?
So what you're saying is that we can take a bite out of that apple more appropriately in a management or the restoration program that you've just described.
Councilmember Murillo and members of the Finance Committee, when in a perfect world we would find a way to restore and manage the bird refuge that enhances water, improves water quality, enhances habitat, allows it to function in an urbanized environment, because that's where it is. It needs to be a managed system to really meet those water quality and habitat restoration objectives. That would be more appropriate for Measure B funds, and that's what we've recommended through the CIP process.
Okay, I do. I feel like Eve looking at the apple, and I'd love to take a bite now, but I will respect the committee's recommendation. That's what I'm thinking today.
Ms. Zachary, a couple questions. The guidelines on the use of Measure B funds, that memo that was included with the council agenda report, has that been formally adopted by City Council?
Councilmember Francisco, members of the Finance Committee, it went to City Council in April 2003 with a recommendation that Council approve those guidelines, and Council did take that action.
Okay.
And I would add, too, one of the things related to the project for the maintenance of the bird refuge is we're required to do the restoration that's proposed as part of the project. Every time you remove habitat, the agencies, in order to get your permits, require you. And over the years, we've looked at mitigation as being not an appropriate use of Measure B funds.
And could you talk a little bit about what all of the goals of this project are? I mean, you talk about conveyance, restoration in some areas of native plants. So could you talk just in general about the different pieces here?
Councilmember Francisco, members of the Finance Committee, the initial construction phase of the project includes removing just under an acre of wetland habitat. So we have a large culvert that essentially drains the watershed into the bird refuge. That's concrete bottom. It's not a natural system. We have a concrete culvert next to the municipal tennis courts and Old Coast Highway. Again, a storm drain structure. The project includes removal of that material completely. It has been allowed to grow over the years as sediment has deposited into those culverts, vegetation grows, and we did not have the necessary permits to do what we've now received permission to do, so we'd wait until things got really bad, apply for an emergency permit. Within the bird refuge itself, there are 3 viewing platforms that were developed, and it provides habitat to hundreds of birds and wildlife species. And so those platforms were developed with grant funds many years ago. Vegetation has had surrounded those platforms, as well as extended out into what we call the islands that you see if you're along the bike path. That's where we had significant issues with mosquito production. So we have people using the park in areas where there's dense vegetation and a difficulty to try to manage the mosquito population. So the vegetation in those 3 areas was removed. And then there's another, the beach area, which is where the parking lot is, and also close to the intersection of Los Patos Way and Cabrillo Boulevard, another storm drain outfall into the bird refuge where dense vegetation made it really difficult to apply the materials, the BT materials that vector control uses. And so we essentially removed vegetation in sort of canals. The amount that we proposed for removal, we balanced with, frankly, what we thought was reasonable as a management strategy, working with vector control. And then we're restoring 0.86 acres. So removing 0.93, restoring 0.86. We don't have to restore the vegetation in the culverts. And so we've been working with the Coastal Commission, we've been working with Fish and Wildlife, we've been working with the Army Corps of Engineers, we've been working with Fish and Game to identify what that restoration is, and we're doing mostly upland habitat restoration. So we're removing non-natives and planting natives, and we are also we're trying to avoid too much additional wetland vegetation, even though that was an initial approach, because that just creates more of the issue that we're trying to manage. And so those plants are being produced and will be planted in the fall. And then throughout the 5-year period, we have the permission through our permits to go keep those culverts clean. So we'll be able to do that, and that's something that we have to program in our annual operating budget in parks, and also remove when it, and this is a lengthy explanation, I realize, when it rains, that vegetation starts floating, and so we have permission to remove that floating vegetation. There is a weir gate at Cabrillo Boulevard, and vegetation will pile up there. Water will overtop onto the roadway. Our permits allow us to remove that vegetation on storm basis at any time during the year. So it's our hope that some of the issues that we've been really grappling with will be much better managed over the next 5 years.
in the areas where you do the restoration and you're putting native plants back in, will there be a problem with the invasive species reinvading, or will that tend to naturally control itself?
Councilmember Francisco, members of the Finance Committee, that's a great question. Once we will be required by our permits to have success, so we will have to minimize the encroachment of non-natives in the areas where we've done restoration. There's a criteria for % success. Over time, a successful habitat restoration, you'll be able to crowd out the non-native species because you will have repopulated the area and plants get to a certain size. So ultimately, that would be the goal. We wouldn't go back and restore that, but we do have to maintain it. We will have to make sure that we keep the area weed-free and that the plants survive, and if they're not surviving, to replant.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Well, I mean, I would just follow the TCC, the Creeks Committee, and if staff is in line with that, then I would support continuing with the general fund. I was very interested in your idea, Mr. Chair. I thought it was a good, creative idea and a valid one to explore. So, but if we're not getting support from either staff or the Creeks Committee, then
Right. Well, I will. I'll just say that I think that I sort of expected the Creeks Committee to tell us what they've told us, and it certainly is in line with the guidelines. I can't argue with that. On the other hand, I also look at what the voters approved when Measure B passed back in 2000, and all the language in that proposition really said is we're going to add 2%, an additional 2% on the TOT, and dedicate that money to improving watershed habitat and water quality. That's really all it says. And I was looking at an article in the news press this morning from back before the election, and one of the things that proponents talked about was establishing a street sweeping program to lessen the amount of trash that's going into the storm drain system and ultimately into the ocean. Of course, lots of cities fund street sweeping programs without having special revenue funds dedicated to creek restoration. So I think there's a question that I still believe needs to be looked at by the full council, especially in a period where the general fund is suffering such severe impact that we're radically reducing parks and recreation funding, as we discussed last night. We've got libraries closed on Monday night. The city has had to make some pretty severe cutbacks, and my view is that this Measure B money was dedicated to improving water quality and improving habitat, not to making sure that the creeks fund was as large as possible, though I certainly understand people involved with it wanting it to be as large as possible. And I think that we may have to face, under the current fiscal constraints, that there's only so much damage that the general fund can sustain. And this is certainly, at least it appears to me to be, it may not be the ideal habitat restoration program, but I certainly think that nexus is there, if I can use that word. So anyway, that remains my opinion, but I will be happy to entertain a motion from my fellow committee members.
Mr. Chair, so are you suggesting that the City Council revisit these guidelines that were adopted in 2003? And can I make that a question to our staff? Can we do that?
Yes, we can.
I asked Ms. Zachary.
I know, but we're the City Council. And their guidelines.
Well, okay, but that's a pretty big deal if we did that. So, but if you're suggesting it, I'm willing to think about it. But I think what I heard you say in the context of this, that the recommendations are following the guidelines as they are.
I think that the recommendation that we got from the Creeks Committee does follow the guidelines that the Creeks Committee created back in 2003. But I also think that there are special economic circumstances that can influence policy. I mean, in an ideal world with a great revenue picture, I don't think we'd be thinking about this.
All right, you have me thinking.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. White?
I would support bringing this to council, for the full council, for a discussion and for further fleshing it out. As I said to open my remarks, I think you have a good point, and it's worth exploring on a wider basis. I'd be interested to hear what council has to say, that is to say our attorney. So I'm willing to, I would propose to forward this to the full council for a discussion without a recommendation one way or another from this committee at this point. But I would think, and I would move that.
Okay.
Can
I
you
hear a motion.
restate what you're moving, Mr. White,
I
please?
move that the Finance Committee forward this item to council for a discussion without a recommendation one way or another of whether we should proceed or not, but to just have a full discussion, and as I say, and also in the presence of our attorney. Thank you.
Is there a second?
Not from me.
I'll second it. Discussion. Anything to say, Ms. Murillo?
Yes. I wanted to honor the guidelines as they are, this recommendation from the Creeks Committee. So no, I guess I wasn't ready to go all the way out on that plank. But I am willing to consider changing the guidelines. I was there when they were adopted. and it was a big deal, and it would be a big deal to change it. So I'll vote no on this, but I'll consider looking at the guidelines, uncomfortably so.
Okay. Thank you. Any further discussion?
Well, I think that we're getting down to the nitty-gritty on the budget now. We've seen some of the difficult options that are before us, and I think that the $40,000 scale, I mean, if you just start looking around at what $40,000 projects we'll be looking at, there's going to be a triage that's going to go on here, and this is yet another one of those opportunities to put things on the table and see which one has the most merit. We're going to be making some choices like that, and particularly as we haven't heard the latest update on the RDA stuff, but it's certainly what we're hearing conceptually is just downright ugly. And so things that we've assumed were bedrock parts of our system are not there, are not going to be there within months. And so we need to be looking with fresh eyes, as you indicated, at this year and this time period, and seeing how we get through it.
Thank you, Mr. White. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed?
No.
Very good. The motion carries. Meeting adjourned.